Welcome everyone to our webinar on getting Brexit ready in relation to supply chain and customs. My name is Lee Squires. I'm a tax director based in Grant Thornton's Belfast office, and I lead our Northern Ireland indirect tax practice, advising clients on VAT and customs duty issues. I'm joined today by my colleague Lorraine Nelson, an associate director in our tax practice in Belfast. We're going to cover the implications of Brexit on customs processes and tariffs, including the special considerations that apply for goods moving across the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, customs special procedures and reliefs, and the implications for supply chains, distribution and regulatory compliance. To begin, it is worth recapping what the status quo is. So at the moment, if EU goods move into the UK, the border is entirely frictionless. There is no customs duty and no adverse VAT cash flow. At present, if goods move into the UK from outside the EU, then an import declaration is required. There can be customs controls and inspections, and customs duty and VAT would be payable. So now let's turn to consider how things could change following Brexit. So in this presentation, we're going to assume a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October. So that would mean that there's a cliff-edge change on Brexit Day with no transitional period, and trade between the UK and the EU will be on third country, or so-called World Trade Organization WTO terms from the 1st of November. This would mean that goods are subject to customs processes and controls and customs duty. There could also be double duties on goods moving across EU and non-EU borders multiple times. UK businesses who have only traded with the EU will need to devise new systems and bear new costs to deal with this. The UK businesses will also lose access to the European Union's network of free trade agreements. As at the date of this recording, the EU and the UK have agreed a revised withdrawal agreement. Now, this must still be approved by the UK and European parliaments, and if it's not agreed, then we will still have a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October unless the UK and the EU agree an extension to that date. If the deal is approved, then we will move into a transitional period which will last until at least the 31st of December 2020. During that period, effectively everything remains the same. The UK continues to follow EU rules and is treated as an EU country for most purposes. Under the new deal, the UK is seeking a free trade agreement with the EU, which would apply from January 2021. The new deal includes a new protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. Under this new protocol, the goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland could be subject to EU tariffs unless they're identified as only being of low risk of crossing the Irish border into the EU, broadly speaking. But the importer can reclaim any duty, and Northern Ireland will also be obliged to apply EU VAT rules. So you can see that even under a deal, there will be changes to the customs and VAT environment in the UK and Northern Ireland. So returning to consider what would happen in the event of a no-deal Brexit, we're going to look at the general rules for EU and UK trade first, and then turn to look at the special rules that could apply in relation to the land border between the UK and the Republic of Ireland. So in order to import and export after Brexit, you will need an economic operator registration and identification, or EORI number. HMRC has allocated those automatically to most businesses that trade with the EU, but if for some reason your business doesn't have one of these numbers, you should apply for that now. Import and export declarations will be needed for each consignment imported from or exported to or exported from the UK, and businesses need to consider how they will comply with this. Most will use a customs agent or freight forwarder, but if you would like to do this yourselves, you will need the special software to communicate with HMRC's customs handling of import and export freight chief system, an authorization or so-called badge to access that system and train your staff in completing the declarations. But fortunately, as we will see, HMRC have introduced something called Transitional Simplified Procedures, or TSP, which allow you to defer the time at which you submit these declarations. So it should also be borne in mind that some imports and exports are subject to licensing or other restrictions. Broadly, where goods move from outside the EU into the UK, an entry summary declaration, or also known as a safety and security declaration, is required. But the UK has said that these will not be required after Brexit on imports from the EU for a period of up to 12 months. So the Transitional Simplified Procedures, or TSP, allow the deferral of import declarations and customs duty payments for up to 6 months if there's a no-deal Brexit. As of this week, all eligible UK-established VAT-registered businesses that import from the EU have been automatically enrolled in TSP by HMRC. Again, if you don't receive a letter to this effect in the near future, you should check with HMRC whether you need to register. If you wish to defer duties, you will also need to apply for a duty deferment account. For most goods, known as standard goods, the procedure under TSP is as follows. You have to make a simplified import declaration in your own commercial records on import. And this record has to be updated once the goods have arrived in the UK. And then you make a supplementary declaration, which is deferred until the 4th working day of the following calendar month. And the payment of duty is deferred until the 15th day of that month, provided you have a duty deferment account. The recent announcement is that you can choose to initially defer your declarations until the 6th of May 2020 and payment of duties until the 15th of May 2020. So that's effectively a 6-month deferral. So that gives businesses a long time to prepare to make customs declarations and pay duties. So you only need to worry about making the simplified import declaration in your own commercial records initially. Controlled goods, which are those goods subject to excise duties or import licensing, follow a slightly different procedure. There must be a simplified frontier declaration made to HMRC on import, but thereafter the process is similar to the standard goods process, so there's a deferred supplementary declaration and payment of duty in the following calendar month. For exporters will also need to submit export declarations as with import and consider whether they will do this themselves or use a freight forwarder or customs agent. If you wish to take responsibility for importing into an EU country, for example, perhaps because your customer wants you to deliver a duty-paid product, then you will also need to consider the import formalities and any customs declaration needed in the EU country of import. Of course, the main impact will be the actual tariffs that are payable. That is the purpose of the customs processes. So if you're exporting to the EU, that is an import into the EU. So the tariff payable is based on a commodity classification system known as the combined nomenclature, which requires you to determine the 10-digit commodity code relevant to your product. And the duty, the corresponding duty, that tells you the corresponding duty under the EU tariff. Now this is not always straightforward. It can be complex, particularly where there are multifunctionary products. And we suggest caution in assuming that the codes used for intra-strat purposes are correct. As these are currently only used for statistical purposes, they've often not been considered in detail. And if you get the wrong code, this could lead to an over or underpayment of duty. For imports into the UK government has announced a temporary import tariff that would apply in the event of a no-deal Brexit. This eliminates or reduces duties on many goods in order to protect consumers and would apply for up to 12 months following Brexit. What's often overlooked is that this means that there's a reduction in tariffs on non-EU imports. So that would mean that UK industry could face more competition from cheap imports from countries like China, for example. This just sets out the the goods that are subject to UK import duties under the UK temporary import tariff, and you can see there the types of products that are subject to duties. Now those are just the headings, so you need to look in detail under those headings at the relevant commodity codes, duty rates and quotas. I'm now going to talk about the special considerations that apply to trade across the Ireland and Northern Ireland border. So the UK government has announced that it would not apply customs formalities or duties on most goods coming into Northern Ireland from the Republic of Ireland. However, declarations would be needed if you're moving a limited number of controlled or licensed goods or goods subject to excise duty, and this would apply for a temporary period. If you move goods through Northern Ireland, however, with the purpose of avoiding UK customs duty, then HMRC have said that the UK tariff would apply, although there are no detailed rules on how this would work, and it's not clear how it would be enforced. And it's important to note that these special arrangements are not reciprocal, they're unilateral arrangements from the UK perspective. So imports into Ireland from Northern Ireland would still be subject to customs duty and controls. Let's turn to very briefly consider the different customs reliefs that are available. So if your tariffs are significant, then the special procedures and reliefs could be used to mitigate the tariff impacts. So one such relief is transit relief, which applies where goods are moving from the EU to the UK and then shipped back to the EU. And we'll come to look at that in a little bit more detail shortly. You could also make use of the customs warehousing procedure, which would avoid double taxations on goods bound for the EU that are imported into the UK but not released for free circulation in the UK. Inward and outward processing relief could potentially help where you're manufacturing in the UK using components derived from the EU. And finally, temporary admission would be relevant where goods are moving temporarily into the UK from the EU or vice versa. Let's look at a little bit more detail in the transit procedure, as this may be helpful to people who are moving goods between, for example, the Republic of Ireland, the UK, and then on to continental Europe through the UK land bridge. There is a union transit procedure that applies where goods are moving within the EU, but we're not going to cover that today as we're looking at the post-Brexit position. So the UK has joined what's known as the Common Transit Convention in readiness for Brexit. The Common Transit Convention regulates the movements of goods between the EU, the EFTA countries, Turkey, and also North Macedonia and Serbia. It allows goods to be moved under suspension of duties and means that customs declarations are not required at each border crossing. So as I said, the common transit procedure could apply where goods are moving from Ireland to the UK and then to another EU country. In order to use the common transit procedure, you need to make an electronic declaration through what's known as the new computerised transit system, NCTS, which is used by the countries that are party to the Common Transit Convention. And goods moving through this procedure must be accompanied by a transit accompanying document. It's possible to apply for simplified transit procedures so that you become an authorised consignor or an authorised consignee. And broadly, this enables transit movements to start or end at the trader's own premises, rather than having to be declared at a customs office. For further details on the indirect tax consequences of a no-deal Brexit, see our separate indirect taxation webinar. This covers more on the VAT impacts, more on customs special procedures and reliefs, and also the impact for UK businesses of the loss of the EU free trade agreements. Finally, let's just consider what Northern Ireland businesses should do now to prepare for these customs changes. Firstly, you should consider how you will submit import and export declarations and comply with the transitional simplified procedures I've described. You will need to look at your commodity codes and work out what the tariffs are on both your imports to the UK and your exports to the EU. You should consider who will be responsible for import formalities and duties in your supply chain, and whether that's your supplier or your customer. You may need to look at your contracts and see and try and determine who would be liable for this, and also whether you should be making changes to your contracts in anticipation of Brexit. If you want to act as the importer of record into EU countries, for example because you want to deliver duty-paid products to your customers, then you may need VAT registrations in those countries and an EU EORI number. You should also think about applying for any customs special procedures and reliefs that could be relevant, and consider the VAT changes, as well as the loss of EU free trade agreements.
And now we're going to look at the supply chain, disruption to that supply chain, and maybe regulatory compliance requirements that you may need to think of in a bit more detail. So supply chain, what does a no-deal Brexit look like? So suppliers' own plans will also affect your plans, because all suppliers will be affected by Brexit. So any resilience will depend on how your suppliers' Brexit plans have been put in place, and basically their overall resilience. This may be across a large number of businesses in multiple tier supply chain, especially for manufacturing and retail sectors. It could also be a handful of key suppliers for services such as IT or employment agencies, and even also thinking about your sundry suppliers within all sectors. There may also be a lot of financial distress within suppliers and distributors, a combination of stockpiling up front, a drop in sales, costs incurred in transport delays and new processes. There may also be possible interest rate and foreign exchange changes, which may seriously impact the cash flow of suppliers. It may be possible that even some may suffer severe financial difficulties or even failure, which will obviously in turn impact your ability to provide your goods and services to your customers. There may also be potential disruption to delivery. So if a no-deal Brexit occurs, borders will impact supply chain inbound, and potentially cause shortages of key components and materials. In the first few days and months of a no-deal Brexit, there may be delays with goods being held up at ports, maybe not even here, but maybe back in Dover. And EU borders will also result in new customs checks and initial chaos. So this will really impact UK supplies for EU operations and EU supplies for UK operations, and also third country imports will also probably get caught up in the disruption as well. So some suppliers may experience initial delays in access and imported products, components and raw materials. But what can companies do now to try and protect and prepare themselves for this type of disruption? So firstly, we would advise businesses to maybe assess the financial stability of the supply chain. So it's probably identifying sort of any suppliers, key suppliers that you may have, and maybe have a look and review to see whether they would be financially vulnerable, and then develop a contingency plan around that, which could include seeking alternative suppliers, extending supply chain finance, or maybe other ways of supporting your suppliers through different credit agreements, or even probably in more extreme cases purchasing distressed suppliers. So we probably do advise people to maybe plan for a sort of 6 to 12 week pause in just-in-time delivery. So it could be having a look to see whether you need to stockpile any key components or sundries that are required, and maybe just review your current products and what are those key components and where are those coming from. It may also be useful to maybe assess delivery routes. Obviously at the moment, majority of the stuff that comes into either Northern Ireland or Republic of Ireland is brought in via the UK land bridge, which is basically the route to market that connects Irish importers and exporters to international markets via the roads and the ports network. And really the benefits of the land bridge really is it provides a much faster transit and strong connectivity to us here in Northern Ireland. So it really is favoured by traders, and around 38% of exports to the EU on the continent is via the land bridge, and it takes around 20 hours less than going solely by sea. So really there probably is various options that people use on the land bridge, probably the roll-on and roll-off services, which is the direct sea route, which takes around 40 hours to arrive at the EU, or the lift-on, lift-off services via the direct sea route, which takes around 60 hours to arrive at the EU continent. So it's probably worthwhile having a look to see, if you are selling things to the continent, how you actually currently sell those, and whether those supply chains do need to be changed. It's also maybe possible that you may need to extend your lead times for deliveries, and especially even also to include any customs contracts, as has been discussed earlier. And maybe even think about maybe providing smaller or larger deliveries. It's also useful to agree your plans with your suppliers. So probably with suppliers, you have your, I suppose your critical suppliers, which are your key materials, your logistics, and probably your employment agencies there if you use a lot of agency workers. But outside of that, there's probably other suppliers that you may need to consult with, especially within the logistics industry. So you would have the likes of freight forwarders, who can provide responsibilities to yourselves, such as to the shippers, booking freight on the appropriate mode of transport for you. They may also provide you packaging, warehousing and distribution services, along with performing the documentation and customs clearance that you may require. You may also want to speak to your suppliers and discuss your current Brexit plans with them, and also share a Brexit plan with those suppliers to ensure everyone's in agreement and they all match up for you as well. And it's also for even those who have not maybe looked at their supply chain at all, is maybe agree some actions quickly, or identify any alternative suppliers that you may have. But mostly key of all is to sort of communicate your Brexit plans with your supply chain. In terms of regulatory compliance, in the event of a no-deal Brexit, this will likely change quite significantly. So products meeting EU standards are currently tested in the EU. They'll continue to be legal to sell temporarily within the UK and will remain legal to sell within the EU. Those were produced to UK national standards, so in areas where there are no EU standards, or maybe their conformity tests are undertaken within the UK, may not be able to be placed in the EU following Brexit. For each specific sector, different regulations and restrictions may apply within the EU in respect of UK goods and services. This will include lots of things, especially from sort of product labelling for different foodstuffs through to border checks. You may need to obtain regulatory licenses and even establish legal entities within the EU to allow you to continue to trade within there. There is a lot of guidance available online, both from the EU or the UK government and then also the European Commission. So it's worthwhile having a look online to see what things may affect you there. With the data requirements, the GDPR rules, which were very recently implemented across the EU, will continue to apply with the UK, and the data can be freely exported from the UK to the EU. So it's probably just businesses may need to add additional safeguards to import data from the EU to the UK. So the GDPR rules state that if you are an organisation outside the EU, which would be the UK post-Brexit, that personally processes personal information in order to offer goods or services to people, then you need to appoint a representative in the EU. With relation to contracts, there may be changes to the legality of the current contracts if they are held within the EU, and that might create some risks, or it may even provide you with some opportunities. For example, client-supplier contracts may include guarantees that become impossible to uphold in the event of Brexit, or if their terms are dependent on your company being within the EU. They may also provide some risk if prices and delivery times do not reflect no-deal realities, and increased costs or delays of ports. So we just maybe want to run through some things that businesses can do now to maybe protect yourself from those potential changes. In relation to the conformity of products, it's probably best to have a review of all your products and specifically look at the different tests and standard testing that are required for each of your products that maybe you manufacture in particular. And it may be you need to look to see where are you selling those. If they're being sold within the EU, your EU conformity testing will be still recognised following Brexit. However, if you are bringing those into GB, you may need to get those registered following the temporary arrangements within the UK's testing body, UCAS. Would also recommend that you explore your sort of sector-specific changes. Again, that's probably speaking to your relevant trade organisation and also looking on the government's no-deal guidance for your sector, and probably just review that with your current plans and maybe check to see if there's anything that you have missed out or may need to add to the to-do list. Also look at how you approach your data. A lot of businesses will have recently brought in the new changes to GDPR, so it's probably going back on those and reviewing how your flow of data is brought throughout the EU and also into Northern Ireland. And it's probably best practice to have a look to see the data transfer between the EU and the UK, and maybe including model contractual clauses which have been approved by the European Commission. This should enable the free flow of personal data, even if the European Union doesn't allow the UK to be treated as an adequate country for data purposes. It's worthwhile looking at the UK Information Commissioner's Office website, and some templates of those clauses are available there. Also, the review of contracts, it may be very beneficial for you to review those. It may have some references to the EU, and particularly with your customers and supplier contracts, is checking to see who's responsible for any potential customs documentation that's required or any additional tariffs or duties. You may want to renew those contracts prior to Brexit, and probably recommend to keep those as flexible as you can, allowing for your prices to change due to inflation or exchange rates, and also allow extension on delivery times or reduction of any penalties that may incur in relation to any late deliveries or supply chain delays. So I'd like to thank you again for listening to our Customs and Supply Chain webinar. If you have any queries, please do not hesitate to contact us.